Welcome back, everyone. And I am now joined by my colleague and former financial aid officer at Loris College, Zachery Gries. Welcome, Zach.
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody.
Hi. So today we're going to talk about the FAFSA
Mm,
and why a family might want to consider completing a FAFSA form. So I guess to get us sort of started, Zach, and make sure we sort of level set and everyone's
Yes.
on the same page, can you explain what exactly the FAFSA is?
Yes, I sure will. The FAFSA, it's an acronym. Financial aid has many acronyms, as you know.
Sure does.
And so the FAFSA stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And the reason I accentuate federal is that sometimes what I believe a family may think is that it's an application for things like the federal Pell Grant. And what I would encourage listeners to recognize is that the federal Pell Grant is a federal program, but many states and institutions also create and invest in need-based aid programs. And so because they don't want to reinvent the application wheel, schools and states will also rely on the FAFSA data. And so I would encourage families to recognize that even though they may look at a Pell Grant chart and think we're above that income, it could still be worth submitting a FAFSA because you might get a state grant. I had many families when I was a financial aid officer that might get a $6,000 state grant, even though they didn't get the Pell Grant.
Ah,
And this would have been years ago. So it's a broad-based tool, and I just want to make sure that the fact that it references federal isn't limiting anybody from focusing too narrowly on what exactly its purpose is.
right. And I think it's a great thing too, that it's sort of this one-stop shop to apply for financial aid. You don't have to apply for the federal aid and the state
Totally.
aid and the college-based aid separately. At most schools, not all, everything's
Yes,
a little
true.
bit more complicated than we'd like.
Yes.
It's one form and it gets you in the running for all the different kinds of financial aid, which is nice.
Yep, and I think you're right. Of course, as soon as we say that, we have to add the nuance, but there are a few states where there might be a state application or colleges, but I think broadly speaking, you're right. It functions kind of like the Common App, and it is meant to simplify this process of claiming need-based aid.
Right. Hashtag it depends.
Yes.
Okay, so now that we've level set, we know what it is, sort of the purpose of the FAFSA. What are the reasons you might want to complete one? And I think probably one is pretty obvious. Others maybe
Yes.
less so.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got about five. And I
Right.
think number one is the fact that it will be used in the evaluation of your ability to claim or receive need-based state funding, federal funding, or institutional funding. Perhaps the most valuable reason. The second, though, is that if even if a family, say, does not get any need-based assistance from the state, the government, or the institution, the FAFSA does unlock a limited amount of loan availability for the student simply on the basis of did the student submit the form or not. And so I know many families I talk to will say, well, we want our student to have some ownership in paying for college, and this may unlock one of the tools they might use to displace some of that ownership. Now, if you're going to a more expensive school, this loan program in and of itself might not necessarily get you as far as you needed to, and there's some other strategies there, but I do think that for many families, even if they're thinking of some small loan to help create financial awareness or use it as a tool to help educate, that might be a benefit for some.
Hmm.
The third reason would be we call it in our world like an insurance policy based reason, because I think a lot of times when I would watch a student progress through college, it's a long journey, 4 years plus, maybe more if they take breaks and depending on what they do in between. And so, or it might be shorter too, but even then, if your financial situation changes, in order for the school to be able to best help you, they got to know where you're starting from. And
Right.
so I think, if a family came to me their third year of college and said, hey, we've never submitted before, can you tell us what to do? I'm kind of shooting in the dark as a financial aid officer. And I
Right.
can't help them use their time effectively or decide what they might expect to set the right to help them anticipate the right expectations. So that would be maybe number three. And then the fourth and the fifth I can blend together quickly, but that would be this notion that some schools or donors or outside scholarships may either require you to submit a FAFSA or
Mhm.
they may require information that you get upon submitting a FAFSA. And so
Uh,
those would be some other reasons I think you might want to at least evaluate if it's the right step for you and the right way to use your time beyond the federal, state, and institutional aid.
yeah, I think that that makes perfect sense. And I always tell folks, you know, Zach, folks will come to us and ask if they need to complete the FAFSA or, I know I'm not going to qualify for financial aid. Why should I complete the FAFSA? And I think you've really kind of broken down the list of reasons well. And I always say, you don't have to submit a FAFSA. Colleges will be happy to accept you without a
Yes.
FAFSA. But before you make that decision, you want to go through that checklist. You want to make sure that you're, first of all, I think make sure that you're not eligible for need-based financial aid, because sometimes people just assume, or my neighbor said they didn't get financial aid, so I assume that I won't, and that's not,
Mhm.
necessarily the case. And actually, what is the best tool, Zach, to figure out if you might qualify for need-based financial aid?
Yes, the best tool, because your need is evaluated relative to the cost of the college,
Mhm.
the best tool that you could use is gonna be something called a net price calculator. Each
Yeah.
college has to maintain one by law. Now, the net price calculator, I sometimes think by law, if a school follows the law rigidly, it doesn't do enough service to the fact that the FAFSA may unlock state or institutional need-based aid. Some net price calculators are really focused just on, do you get a federal Pell Grant or not?
Mhm.
So I think the more robust net price calculators, though, are aiming to try to provide more accuracy. Whether or not it's totally accurate, I think that's still the best tool to use.
Yeah,
But I think just
completely.
be cautious that the simpler the form is, the perhaps the more limited the information it provides will be.
Totally. The more of a pain in the neck it is to fill out the form, the more you can actually trust the results.
Yes, exactly.
I think that's a good rule of thumb. So yeah,
Bingo.
so what I tell people, do the net price calculators,
Yes.
right? Make sure you're not eligible. And if you find out you're not eligible for need-based aid through the net price calculators, okay, that's one of the check boxes, but you need
Yes.
to think about the other things. Do you want to take advantage of any of those student loans?
Bingo.
Do you want that insurance policy?
Mhm.
Is everybody's job situation is very stable, or maybe not? Maybe you want to get that form on file just in case. And then
Totally.
that merit scholarship piece that you mentioned, I think is also so important. I think we've seen sort of more of a trend, while most colleges don't require the FAFSA to apply for merit scholarship. We've seen that, I think, that kind of ticking up in recent years,
Yeah.
that more and more schools are making that a requirement. So you
And
don't want to take those merit scholarships off the table, right?
yeah, completely, and even deviating outside of merit, I've done a
Mhm.
few outside scholarship searches, and I think I'm always
Yeah,
surprised how many of them say you have to have a FAFSA or it's got all these criteria that says you have to have need, and so I just think that even if you're saying, "Well, we don't care so much about merit, but we want outside scholarships," still serves the same purpose.
exactly. Yeah. So you want to go through that checklist in your mind before you
Yeah.
decide not to complete the FAFSA. So you can go through the checklist, and you don't, it's not required for merit scholarships or any of the outside scholarships you're looking at. You're not planning on borrowing student loans. You feel like your job situation's real stable, that you don't need that insurance policy, and you've
Mhm.
done the net price calculators and you know you're not going to qualify for need-based aid. I think only in that circumstance might you decide not to complete the FAFSA.
Totally.
Um, and actually, we should sort of clarify, I guess, that point. Are there any really reasons why you wouldn't say, you might decide you don't think it will do you much good, but could any negatives come from it? Are there any real reasons not to complete the FAFSA?
There could be, and I think you alluded to it when you were chatting, when we were chatting, because I think some schools, depending on their admission policy,
Hmm.
may add a little more complexity to this decision-making process, because some schools use what's called a need-aware admission policy. So they are factoring in a family's choice either to or not to submit a FAFSA in their
Hmm.
decision on who gets admitted. And they may be factoring in things like a student and their family's income, assets, things like that. Now, even in that case, you never know really if it's going to help you or hurt you. If the school is trying to just go for a diverse campus, it may be that submitting it is going to be helpful to you if less families typically submitted at this school. Vice
Mhm.
versa, if the school is really trying to increase families that don't submit FAFSAs because they're lacking that representation, it might hurt you. You just never really know because it's so relative based on the pool of students considering the college any given year. But that policy, though, may give you some additional questions that you could use to ask the school for some clarifying information to try to really dig into your decision to submit or not.
Completely. And I think from my experience, Zach, I don't know if you feel the same way. I feel like you laid it out perfectly at need-aware schools. The fact that you may or may not have applied for financial aid or need financial aid may come into play in your admissions decision. I feel like it comes into play less often than families perceive
Totally, I would agree with
that,
that.
that it does. Yeah, I think, you know, and I think it often comes into play thinking about where I hear it the most is regarding the very, very super selective schools,
Yeah,
which, by the way, are close to without exception need blind. They do
true.
not take your financial aid, your finances into account at all when making their admissions decisions. But I think it can be um, sort of an easy um, reasoning of you hear your friends and neighbors talking. My child didn't get accepted to Harvard. Let's say let's talk about our listeners know we just talked to Emmy who went to Harvard.
Yep.
My kid didn't go to Harvard because I filed a financial aid application because I needed
Mhm.
financial aid. That's why they denied my kid. I think it's an easy place to put to find a reason why your excellent student did not get into Harvard when the truth is probably far more complicated than that. And a school like Harvard or these other super selective schools that only accept, 5, 6, 7% of their applicants who are by and large all, straight A students. What on earth could be the reason? And I think sometimes it gets misassigned to needing
Yes.
financial aid when in fact that is not the reason.
And I think your point is so true, in addition to the fact that even for that family who said, "We didn't get in because we needed the assistance," the alternative decision isn't all that much better. Okay, so you
Yes.
don't submit the financial aid application, and then you do get into the college, but now the college is unaffordable. So
Yes.
I think you're sort of in a position where if you need the assistance, you may have to toss out the risk that a college is going to use that against you, because if you need the assistance, it doesn't do any good to get into a college and then not afford it. So I think that's
Yes.
such a good point that, while you might say it's because of this reason, it's when you're comparing the two options, neither of them may have gotten the student the outcome they wanted.
Exactly right. I think that's such a super good point. Um, Now, can anyone who wants to submit a FAFSA, Zach?
It has to, so the FAFSA, it is a federal form, and so you have to have, as a student, it's a student's application, you have to have a student social security number.
Okay.
So that would be the limiting factor. You may, if you don't have a social security number, there's still other options. You just would want to work with the school to figure out what other options they have to collect your income and asset information.
Totally. And I think that's an important point that it's based on the student having a social security number. It's a student that needs to be a US citizen or permanent resident. The
Hmm.
parents do not.
True.
So it's absolutely fine if a student has a parent who's not a US citizen, they can still apply for financial aid using the FAFSA.
Yes.
And some schools offer international students financial aid. They will likely require a different form, probably called the CSS profile.
Yep.
But there are other options for students in that situation. And we do have a new FAFSA this year, Zach.
Yes.
I don't know if you've heard.
Yes. I've heard a
So
few things.
yeah. So can you talk a little bit about this new version of the form and how that may affect any of this?
Yes, yes. The new version of the form, it's currently being implemented as we speak. It's the first year. I many of our listeners may have heard of it framed through some disappointing perspectives. I think that's how many of us in the industry are feeling. It's the timelines are off, the processes are have been challenging. Some of the data we might get on one day has to be changed in a couple days because of a calculation error most recently. But I suppose what I wanted to help accentuate for listeners today is that the overall intent of this change is threefold. Number one, make the form easier. So a lot of families who have submitted the form and at least done their part, if it went all right, they have. I remember one family had said we had to go back and check because it seemed too easy. You know, in prior years we hear these narratives that it's such a hard form, and this year it felt easier. That was the intent. So
Yes.
I think as we work through the clunkiness, you can rest assured, or at least be hopeful, I should say, that this will be an easier process. And so if you had problems in January and you're a senior, I wanted to just make a point that the Department of Ed is working
Hmm.
tirelessly to fix this
Yes.
stuff. So if you're in that mindset of I tried it, it was a pain, maybe try it again at some point. The second thing is that more students should get need-based aid. And if you have states and institutions awarding on the basis of FAFSA, and the FAFSA is changing its mechanism to give more students needier presentations, then it stands to be true that those many students may get additional assistance from this change. And I wanted to just mention that as well. So I think big picture, long term, hopefully this is a great change. I think it will be, but there is some rocks this first year.
For sure. And we're just about out of time.
Ah,
In like 1 minute, Zach,
yeah.
is there anything else that students and families should know?
I would say the remainder part of this year, if you've got a senior in high school who's submitting the form and going through the process, be patient. It seems like many schools are offering patience. They're bumping back deadlines. If
Yeah.
you have a student who is younger, it remains to be seen if the FAFSA will now go back to an October 1st start or if it's going to
Mhm.
be a little later. We don't really know. So what I would just say is monitor the situation, tune into our podcast, use whatever resources you can, because I think right now it's just constant change. And if you can accept that and you've got good resources to learn and keep tabs on it, I think you're in good shape.
Absolutely. It is a stressful year. I think we can't deny that. But yeah, stay tuned to these resources that you have available to you. We will help try and get you through this process with
Yes.
a minimum of stress. I don't think we can totally take it away, but we will do what we can to at least keep you informed, and you will get through it. I can be confident in that statement. So thank you so much, Zach, for sharing your wisdom today and joining us.
Yes. Hey, great to see you. Good to talk with all of the listeners and hope you have a good day.
Thanks so much. And thank you, everybody, for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. We greatly appreciate your feedback. And please join us next week when we're going to be talking about the different types of college savings accounts that are available and what to do if you are a high school senior who is maybe just now deciding that you want to go to college, or perhaps you're realizing that you don't want to attend any of the colleges that accepted you. Yikes. But don't worry, you do have options and we will break them down for you. So tune in next week. And remember, we are here every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Pacific.